Fearim fíor chuoin fáilte ag an tríú léocht sa trá seo atá agraí ag acad a bhríoga na hÉireann nómós go Colum Cille im líon chomórtha seo a bhreithe 1500 bliain ó chuin. Cúi an tar atá idir leabhlann an acadamh agus coiste na Gaeilge, fitriach na Gaeilge agus na gultúr Celtach. Sé tlach, fíortlach go han gonsa fáilte chuir ar cárstan ar fig an túil agus gúthairí an nálapa. Ag an tréis óráid seo an san tré a dhéanana cóthraigh ar Colum Cille, a bhá agus a háháast chocotramach an cultúr an dáhuaigh agus na saite ngéin. Good afternoon. My name is Marvin, and on behalf of the Royal Irish Academy, I welcome you to the third in our series of lectures commemorating Colum Cille or Columba in this major anniversary of his birth. The series itself reflects Colum Cille's life in some ways. It was conceived in Ireland, but has spread beyond Irish shores in its subject matter and its participants. By participants, I mean its illustrious speakers and the many hundreds of the fully registered. I'm happy to report, however, that it did not involve at any stage battles, disputed manuscripts, or the defeat of demons. We are very fortunate to have today's session chaired by Professor Ruairí O'Higgins, Director of the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies. Ruairí.
Good morning, I'm a jay Halichte van the Kion du, August Hannah Orumru, or Radichi and Land you, Horst Stach, get nach Elchen and Lahar and Tay and Akadev, a Hashan Dochus, Gordon Orumrun, Tilug go Beha Avistach, a Yakar. Ni Moja Gurga, Thomas Owen Clancy, Hornana, Gogalioragi, Italian, New, Os Fata Farshan, a Tahal, Mar Scolaire. Agus mar lechtdóid. Ach dóibh siúd nach bhfuil ólach ar chuid oibre, ní miste chuide dá gaisce scoláire a thabhairt chun cuimhne. Thomas Owen Clancy is a graduate of New York University. He took his doctorate at Edinburgh University and since 2005 has been professor of Celtic at Glasgow University. He has very many publications to his name, and these range through language and literature, onomastics, epigraphy, and hagiography. He has offered us stimulating studies, both of texts and of themes in medieval literature, and has dealt with knotty linguistic and literary problems, and has presented us with edited texts and translations. I think it is fair to say that he has shamelessly and fearlessly argued for a Scottish provenance for many early texts that were otherwise assumed to have been composed in Ireland. This being a necessary corrective, lest the Irish lose the run of themselves. But in his many publications over such a wide range, there's one area that has captured his attention, and that, of course, is Iona and Colum Cille. Together with Gilbert Marcus, he published in 1995 Iona, the earliest poetry of a Celtic monastery, a study of this pivotal center of learning, together with editions and translations of some of the texts we associate with it. He has published further studies on the Columban monastic family, on St Adamnan, Colum Cille's biographer, and indeed on further aspects of Scottish hagiography. He currently leads a research project, Iona's Namescape, Place Names and their Dynamics in Iona and its Environs, an investigation of the place names of Iona, the nearby island of Staffa, and what they can tell us about history and tradition, settlement and society on those islands. As part of this project, they will host a conference in December of this year about Iona and Colum Cille, and this is an event we can all look forward to. I believe that today's talk will also be informed in part by Thomas's research on the namescape of Iona. Marsin guntilach dal, irime an arthol of Clancy on orage ege a port shachad. Tir, tráig, tuile, land, strand, and tide. Colum Cille's voice and the poetics of place. So I hand you over to our speaker today, Professor Thomas Owen Clancy. Gormagad.
Well, Gormagad Rory agus a bhaire, ha mé buíochaibh agus the Academy Real na Aiden son Colum gal na Horaige seo nuamh Colum Cille. I'm most grateful to you both and to the Royal Irish Academy for giving me this opportunity to speak about a subject, as Rory has said, of long-standing interest to me. Indeed, a subject which has been with me for much of my academic life. I'm just going to share my screen now, which I've forgotten to do. Is that visible to you all? Great, thanks. The subject, of course, is Colum Cille, St Columba, and it's great to be speaking about him in this special centenary year. I'm not sure about the demons. We had a bit of trouble with Zoom to start with, so maybe we did have to dispel some demons before we could get going. In 1774, the Reverend James McLagan, chaplain to the Black Watch and man behind one of the 18th century's most important collections of Gaelic manuscripts, recorded his journey through the Hebrides. Dr. Peadar O'Murcherty of Aberystwyth and Copenhagen universities has been working on an edition of this journey, and I'm indebted to him for sight of his account and for allowing me to show a bit of it to you today. Inevitably, McLagan went to the island of Iona, which was then starting to exhibit the first real flourishing of the tourism industry, which has never really died down since. In his account of Iona, McLagan describes Colum Cille thus: he was from Arran in Ireland, which I take to have been an island off the coast of Ulster, rather than the Arran in the Bay of Galway in Connacht. Be that as it will, he aimed at some higher dignity in a monastery there, had a rival that got the better of him, so that he was obliged or chose to decamp. Upon this occasion, he wrote an Irish poem bidding farewell to his beloved Arran, of which I had a copy from the curious and learned Major Valencia, wherein the good man curses his antagonist very heartily. In the McLagan manuscript collection in Glasgow University Library, we have the very copy which McLagan talks about here, in the hand of the well-known Irish antiquarian, Major Charles Valencia. Valencia almost certainly copied it either directly from a medieval manuscript or from a close copy thereof. The underlying medieval manuscript was the 15th century British Library additional manuscript 30512. Oh, sorry, my slides stopped advancing for a minute. There we go. And this is that manuscript. You can see the poem in question starting here, Celebrid Uamse Daring. A host of other scribes copied texts, including this poem, from this manuscript in and around Dublin when it was there in the late 18th century. 4 such manuscripts are in the Royal Irish Academy itself. I'll show you 3 on the slide here. This episode illustrates some of the rich networks of exchange between Scottish and Irish scholars and antiquarians in the 18th century, as recently explored in a conference held here, or I suppose there, at the Royal Irish Academy by colleagues from Glasgow. Networks which I hope this lecture today shows remain strong in other ways also. What of the poem, however, and why did it convince McLagan that Colum Cille was from Arran? It has to be said that McLagan seems not to have entirely understood the poem. This is a feature of his grappling with earlier poetry in medieval texts and in a number of other places in his collection. Though he was probably right, he perhaps was right, I should say, in thinking that the poem may refer to the Arran Moor in County Donegal rather than the County Galway Arran, but this is not the place to debate that particular issue, and I'm undecided on it anyway. The poem, Celebrid Uamse Daring, Farewell from Me to Arran, dates perhaps to the 12th century. That's kind of a rough guess. It might be known to anyone who studied T.F. O'Rahilly's Mescra Donta, because he edited some of its stanzas there. It's in the voice of Colum Cille, a voice which we'll explore in the course of this paper. In the paper, Colum Cille bids a regretful farewell to Aaron, noting that he is going against his will. Isedd Traidis Mochrithe gan fydd thir ar y tynydd et y drongydd nyf nive. This is what has wounded my heart, not to be in the west on her waves, among throngs of the saints of heaven. He praises it and contrasts its fate and that of those who remain there with his own. Ochus cían rum curid o Aiden tír, curis log monydd amach ar inchiv na nan alabanach. It's far that I've been put from Aaron in the west, as far as the host of Monydd abroad, under the protection of the Scotsman. Monydd here is a frequently used kenning or sort of nickname for Scotland. He describes Aaron as full of white angels, and in the final section of the poem goes on to detail the island's rota of angelic visitations for each day of the week. Gabriel comes on Sundays, Michael on Mondays, Raphael on Tuesdays, etc., etc., all finishing up with the Virgin Mary visiting on Saturdays. And the poem concludes with the wistful sentiment I've given you on this slide: though there be nothing to life except listening to the angels of Aaron, better than any nourishment under heaven is listening to the singing. This is one of hundreds of poems from the Middle Ages spoken in the voice of Colum Cille, Colum Cille, St Columba, in whose memory this series has been established to celebrate the 1500th anniversary of his birth. As most of you will know, Columba was born in Donegal, though not in Arranmore, to one of the highest ranking families, but he became a churchman and left Ireland for Britain, where he would eventually die. That moment of leaving Ireland became an elaborated tradition, and as we shall see, it became a key node point in his story, whatever the real circumstances behind it. He founded many monasteries, including a number on the west coast of what is now Scotland, chief among them being on the island of Iona. That monastery and the federation of monasteries which looked to him as founder were amongst the most significant of the early Middle Ages, not only in the Gaelic-speaking regions of Ireland and Scotland, but further afield as well, with historical and literary influences stretching to England and continental Europe. Though it's very variable, the poetry in Colum Cille's voice often takes up events from his life, real or imagined, or plays with the situation poets would imagine he would have been in. Colum Cille's associations with many places, the monasteries he had founded, such as Durrow or Derry, his Irish homeland and his new land in Olapa, gives much of the poetry in his voice a particular connection with the idea of place, and my talk is intended in part as a way of exploring some of those connections. The particular type of poetry that we have here, maybe I'll go back to the previous slide, the particular type of poetry that we have here, whereby a later poet inhabits the voice of an earlier character, whether historical or fictional, is extremely common in medieval Gaelic literature. Indeed, I would say it's one of the great highlights of the medieval Gaelic tradition. Some of the finest early medieval Gaelic poetry is written in this vein, from Deirdre lamenting the death of her lover and his brothers, to the Cailleach Mhéire meditating on her old age, to Mad Suvna, Sweeney Astray's conflicted poems of the wilderness at its most brutal and beautiful. At its best, this technique allowed Gaelic poets to get inside the heads of characters, particularly at difficult, emotional, often tragic points in their lives, sometimes producing poetry of what Frank O'Connor described as great, quote, psychological maturity. In her influential 1996 exploration of this phenomenon, Professor Maria Tomocko called this the poetry of masks. The idea being that poets, in composing these poems, effectively put on what she calls a traditional poetic mask. I've myself generally preferred the term voice, since the image of the mask doesn't sit very comfortably within the context of Gaelic culture as we know it, at any rate. Nonetheless, Professor Tymoczko's discussion is highly relevant. She argues that rather than employing a voice that spoke as if it was the poet's own voice, instead, quote, in order to express most of the range of human affective experience, Celtic poets assumed the persona of a traditional fictional character. Now, although he was undoubtedly a real historical person, within this poetic context, Columba was one such traditional fictional character, taking his place alongside the likes of Fionn McCool, Suvne, Gormley, Deirdre, and many, many more. We have poetry said to have been spoken by Columba ranging across hundreds of years of composition, and there are hundreds of poems in medieval and early modern Irish manuscripts preceded by the words Colum Cille Kekenit. Columba sang this. Oops, sorry. One manuscript in particular, Oxford's Bodleian Library manuscript, Lord Miscellany 615, is almost exclusively made up of poems either about Columba or attributed to him. One such poem from that manuscript, Scia J Doniv Umum, will be the subject of one of next week's papers by Dr. Charles Dillon. And I'm sure you'll hear more about the manuscript then too. Unlike some of these other characters, perhaps, Colum Cille is invested with poetic opinions on a very wide range of topics. So his traditional poetic mask, in Tymoczko's terms, is much more variable. We have poetry in his voice complaining of the weariness of his hand in writing. I've given you a verse from the famous poem Ysgith Mochrov on Scrivain here from Lord 615. We've got poems asking for protection on the road, threatening baleful prophecies to those who allowed Iona to be taken over by Benedictines. He exchanges poetic compliments with other saints and thus becomes a conduit of the sort of saintly praise poem that he himself was an object of in various poems, such as the one discussed by Jacopo Bisagni last week, the Avre Colum Cille, the Elegy of Columba. Indeed, it's among the later prefaces and commentaries to the Avre that we find some of the earliest attributions of poems to Colum Cille, at least earliest in terms of the manuscripts that they appear in, is what I mean there. The preface and commentary in the Bodleian text of the poem is littered with short tales and anecdotes, in many of which Columba is a poetic conversant with kings and warriors. Some of the copies of the Avre are followed by a series of poems in his name, some of them in praise of God or in praise of other saints. In the Lever na Huidre, Leon O'Hire, held in the Royal Irish Academy, among other versions, at the very beginning of the preface, we're told of his uttering the famous short poem, Fil Soon Glash, Feigvas Aiden Dadahash, Naka Nakiva Ir Matha, Firu Aiden. There is a grey eye which looks back at Ireland, which will never after this see the men of Ireland or its women. If there's one particular emotional juncture in Columba's life, which is used as a springboard for poetry, it's this one, his traditional exile from Ireland, with all the emotional conflict and turmoil that comes with it. This aspect was explored in depth in 2005 by Professor Moira Harbert in an article called Becoming an Exile. There she pointed in particular to the way that certain poems use Columba's voice as a way of expressing not just the concept of separation from Ireland, but also thereby creating a kind of national identity for Ireland, importantly in contradistinction to Gaelic Scotland. She singled out in that article a poem from perhaps around the year 1000, as displaying all the tropes of this tradition, a poem found in a variety of medieval manuscripts, including Royal Irish Academy 23 N10. Robert Mialoch avec Mothe Dingnev Brevim Asnev Tar Toing Tober Nilin Dochem Naden. It would be pleasant, O son of my God, in wondrous voyagings to travel over the deluge-fountained wave to Ireland, in Gerard Murphy's translation. Of the poem, she says that its most innovative aspect, quote, is its presentation of Colum Cille as a distinctive exilic persona, person of exile, banished because of a past deed. He reflects on his situation, contrasts the joys of home with the sorrows of alienation, and assuages the pain of separation through imaginary return. And this, of course, is the voice that we find in the Farewell to Arran poem I began with. Although Professor Herbert has rightly drawn out from this corpus the way in which it builds an image of Ireland in exile, referring to J.F. Kenny's notable, if perhaps overstated, description of it as, quote, the earliest Irish corpus of formally nationalist propaganda, it's fair to say that there's a great deal of much more specific poetry of place in the corpus also, like our Arran poem, where our speaker is yearning not for Ireland in general, but for one small island in particular. Other locations get this treatment too, as witness a quatrain embedded in the Middle Irish life of Columba, is ara charim duda, ara reide, ara glonje, aris lomalon angel fin on chin conike arella. This is why I love Derry, for its calmness, for its brightness, for its being jam-packed full of white angels from one end to the other. Other poems use the names of places associated with Columba allusively, the poet's gesturing with these names in order to evoke his affection and perhaps also to trigger with the audience many traditional linkages which would be known between the saint and them. In one poem, quite an ominous poem, perhaps of the early 13th century, called Marav Anoch Moholensa, Dead Tonight is My Body. The voice of Columba evokes all the graveyards in Ireland and Scotland. He calls them bright, noble standards, a relic Auden in Iona, Derry, and then beloved victorious Dunkeld, Enoch and Jan Patrick, Culloch of the horns and feasting, fierce wave, deep grey Torre, leafy, bright, thicketed Derry, Kells, the head of the clan, renowned, windowed Durrow, sword, and Colum Cille. The same poem, spoken by the dead Columba, angry and distressed at the change of regime in Iona, speaks affectionately of Relig Oren, the burial ground near to the abbey in Iona, Relig Oren of my heart, as he calls it. Just a picture of it there on the slide. Marvelous Relig Oren, on which I spread Roman soil, generous, true judging Mary comes to bless it every noon. Every morning on rising early, I used to go sunrise round the graveyard. Your sorrow and your awful burden are forgiven you when you go there. I think this is significant. Much of what we've looked at so far draws a contrast, often explicitly or sometimes implicitly unfavorable, between Columba's homeland and the land of his exile in what is now Scotland. But not all the poetry in Columba's voice looks back with regret. And it's to another poem that I wish to turn in the final third of this paper that does something different. This is a poem found in two manuscripts, one in Brussels and one in Edinburgh. And I've shown you the Edinburgh version here from Advocate's manuscript 7215, as well as Donald McKinnon's edition or transcription of the poem as well from that manuscript. This poem also was edited by T.F. O'Reilly in Mescredanta, though for some reason modernized to 17th century forms. It's more likely, to my eye at any rate, to be from, I don't know, the 12th century or thereabouts. The poem begins, Mialoch lim vi in ucht eilen, for being carige, delight I'd find in an island's breast, on a rock's peak, that there I might often gaze at the sea's calm, that I might see its heavy waves over the brilliant sea as it sings music to the Father on its constant way. This is a very different poem of place. This instead is place creation. Here the poet builds up an ideal image, not of Ireland, or his lost homeland. I think implicitly in this poem, this island in his mind must not be in Ireland. Instead, it's of the perfect island rather, of his desire. This island is perfectly set so as to cause meditation on the beauty of nature in the speaker, the sea's calm, or the waves of the sea against the rocks, the seabirds, the whales. Here in exile, he could be happy. On this island, the speaker could spend the perfect life of a religious person, sometimes reading, sometimes praying, sometimes gathering seaweed or fishing, sometimes giving food to the poor, sometimes alone in his cell. Could bianachin in cáimhe chuna uile neve conimid nrai gaglonia chia chai tuile. That I might bless the Lord who rules all, heaven with its crowd of pure ranks, land, strand, and tide. And its wonderful final verse, or its final verse in the Brussels manuscript at any rate, contemplates spending a while at work which would not be exhausting. It would be delightful. And I think that's a sentiment we could all agree with, really. The poem pivots at its midpoint, the 6th stanza, when it's 11 stanzas, though in the Edinburgh manuscript there are 12. At any rate, at its midpoint, it pivots on a verse in which the speaker reveals his secret identity, as well as embracing the exilic lifestyle. He wishes to be on this island, connaching a tráig sa tuile in the réimim, cometh minim, rún, not raigim, coolry Aiden, that I might see the seas ebb and flow in their sequence, that this might be my name, a secret I tell, or that I tell you, back towards Ireland, back turned towards Ireland. In this verse, the speaker identifies himself with this stance of having his back turned away from Ireland. It echoes the traditions that Columba vowed never to set eyes on Ireland again, as found in the preface to the Avra, but also more modern traditions in which Columba looked successively for a place where he would no longer be able to see Ireland before finally settling down when he found one. This legend is associated with a number of locations in the Hebrides, usually called variations on Colum Cille Aiden, the cairn of back turned towards Ireland. It's quite a strange place name, really. We might imagine then, perhaps, that this secret name in the poem binds the speaker not only to the voice of Columba and his story, but also to a place such as this, traditionally linked to this phrase, Coolry Aiden. One place in particular stands out in this regard, and that's Carn Coolry Aiden on Iona, the place where, after all, Columba did come to settle. Accounts of the tradition from the 18th century have Columba landing in Portachurig, down here, on the Ritchie's wonderful map from the 1920s and 30s. Just as an aside, there's a marvelous blog about the Ritchies and their map on the project website that Ruairi mentioned at the beginning. Anyway, accounts have him, Columba landing in Portachurig and then climbing the highest hill that he could see to confirm that he could no longer see Ireland from it. Although the poem could be read as setting out the building blocks for the perfect monastic fantasy island, at the same time, it seems likely that the island being described here is Iona itself, the voice of Columba turning here from nostalgia for his homeland to love of that perfect place where he settled. Read in this way, as well, we return to the description of where the speaker wishes to be. In Nucht Allen, Bein Carige, in the breast of an island, on a rock's peak. A very fitting description of the situation of Carn Coolry Aiden in its situation at the height of Drumanuni. And this is just, I was there on Sunday, at a slightly wet moment on Sunday, has to be said. And just for scale, a picture of my colleague, Gilbert Marcus, next to the cairn itself with with the sea beyond. I don't want to push this argument too far, however. The poem is medieval, the tradition of the place name is early modern. I think one could do too much with this. However, this does fit into a context in which place names in Iona are very slippery things. And I just wanted to make a brief aside before returning to the core theme of this paper, about the project that Rui mentioned at the beginning. I'm engaged in this 3-year project funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council alongside a number of colleagues named here, examining Iona's namescape and its dynamics, as we've called them. One particularly distinctive aspect of that landscape is the way in which over the centuries it's been read and reread against the literature associated with Columba and against traditions of him, and also against expectations, a sort of religious romanticism of what the island and its monastic inhabitants might have been like or should have been like. Should a circle of stones in the hills be read as a sheep fank or a hermit's cell? We can see traditional associations of certain places, Portachurig, which I've already mentioned, where Columba landed and where stones were being taken and used as talismans or souvenirs since at least the 16th century. We can see these traditions being constantly renewed against the backdrop of texts that or literature or traditions that people would become familiar with and maybe lose familiarity with as well. In this context, the idea that a place might both be given the secret identity of Columba and might be taken in turn as a way of rooting him to that particular place through poetry seems to me at least plausible. But like I say, I don't want to push this argument too far. Of course, we're dealing with a highly romanticized vision of place in this poem and of the religious life as well. It's this sort of poem that Donoghue O'Connor was thinking of, surely, when he laid his charge against early Irish hermit poetry in 1989, casting a cold eye on the idea that in poetry of this sort, we have the effusions of people who really knew life in the countryside, noting, I doubt very much whether hermits wrote poems like this. Rather, it seems to me to be a conscious work of art and in no sense a record of life lived. Well, I agree with this in many ways, and it's an article I dearly love. I do think his rejection went in some ways too far. People who live in a landscape can, in poetry, romanticize that landscape. There is an artistry at work in these poems. These poems are of human manufacture, and so is the landscape that they create and evoke. But, as I explored in 2014, there is an eye for nature and life in it in these poems, as in Mialach Lemvi, which casts a romantic spell and is meant to. That's what it's trying to do. I spent a chunk of my academic career being a bit grumpy about romantic visions of Columba and the monks of Iona, and to some extent I remain so. Our evidence of the earlier texts from Iona is a very different sort of culture and set of religious values than those often invested in the island in more recent times. It's a harder edged idea of Christianity, sometimes a less forgiving one. But in the past decade or so, I've been increasingly struck by the way in which these romantic visions of the island, of the saint, are not, as is often imputed, the creation of romantic travelers of the 18th and 19th century, or of Celtic revival movements of the 19th and early 20th century, or the Celtic Christianity movements, which gained force from the middle of the 20th century itself. Instead, some of these very tropes and attitudes are very much a creation of medieval Gaelic literature itself. It's Columba, in the voice given to him by medieval poets, who finds white angels everywhere, who weeps for his lost homeland, who depicts a rosy, optimistic island paradise. Indeed, much as Moir Herbert found in the exilic poetry in Columba's voice the roots of expressions of Irish national identity, so from a Scottish Gaelic perspective, one might find in it, though not in it alone, the roots of the Gaelic literary mode of cianalus, a longing for place. Cianalus is a heavily weighted word in Gaelic, and I've been given the impression that there isn't quite an Irish equivalent, though cua is perhaps closest. Professor Lillis O'Leary, speaking here of song, gives this useful set of equations. The emotion elicited when songs are performed in such a context is called in Ireland cua. That word is also used with the meaning of loneliness, longing, and lament. And in Scotland, it is particularly associated with instrumental laments. However, in Scotland, the emotion elicited is more often called cianalus, an idea related to the term siarach, linked to plaintive music, cognate with Welsh hirais. The terms cua and cianalus are considered natural and expected parts of the human condition. Akin to the concept of nostalgia, it is central to aspects of Ossianic literature. This concept and its place, often its predominance in certain parts, certain times during the Gaelic poetic tradition, has been well explored in a modern context by Professor Michelle MacLeod of Aberdeen University. So many of the tropes associated with what she calls the cianalus code can be found in the voice of the exiled Columba. Quote, severe melancholy, the weakening state of the individual, the desire to return, the perpetuation of images of home. It might be difficult to trace a direct line between the displaced Columba and the displaced Gael of the emigrant centuries, just as it's difficult to trace a direct line between early Gaelic nature poetry and the 18th century Gaelic poetry, which in many ways resembles it. But there's something suggestive about this nonetheless. It's perhaps this which led the poet Ruairí Mac Thomas to allude codedly to Columba in one of his own conflicted poems of cianalus for his home island of Lewis, a reference that was noted by Michelle MacLeod in the article I just mentioned. Bracht kiere mahul chors nach eich mi vuam de huglug elend hier is mirgein orst gewoen, a waxed bandage for my eyes so that I may not see there how you have changed, dark brown island that I have missed so long. The references to the prose account in the preface to the Avra, which precedes the poem that I mentioned earlier, Fil Sún Glas, there is a grey eye that looks back. Quote, this is from, not sure which version of the Avra preface this is, I'm sorry. And they say that Columba did not see Ireland then when he went back to settle a dispute, because a wax cloth, anert kiere, used to be over his eyes. The reason for that being that when he passed over, he promised he would never see Ireland again, saying, there is a grey eye, etc., etc. Now, given that Ruairí Mac Thomas was, under his other guise, Professor Derek Thompson, one of my predecessors in the chair of Celtic in the University of Glasgow, it's not continuity of imagery we're seeing here, but a knowing and subtle intertextual allusion. Sorry. In this talk today, I've tried to give an impression of one strand within the very wide-ranging corpus of poetry that medieval Gaelic poets placed in the mouth of Colum Cille. As Moira Herbert has shown, his exile from Ireland made him a spokesman for a place-based nostalgia, particularly for his Irish homeland. And that nostalgia fed into one strand of a growing Irish national identity in the 10th century and beyond. At the same time, I've been stressing here the way in which Colum Cille becomes a vessel for poets who want to express their devotion to or longing for very particular places, smaller places. Angels are everywhere here, a trope continued from Avenon's Life of Columba. Our spokesman here can see the special, blessed qualities of a place which might elude others with less visionary eyes. But we've also seen how the voice could be used to embrace the new exilic lifestyle, to glory in the island life, its closeness to nature, and to God, and its potential to lead to self-discovery. In all this, we catch an echo of the much later emigrant experience, as sung and written many times over in modern Gaelic tradition. On both sides of Strúna Mhuile, Colum Cille, Colum Cille straddles his 1500 years in ways which remain relevant to the long and rich Gaelic literary tradition. Tachbalaif, Kudamakif, thank you all.
Well, go to Milamat, Thomas, as a gains Vrashin, Kaints Spragul, Given, Agus Kaints Lading, and Talk the one Le Colum Cille. This was a very interesting and inspirational lecture that again focuses our attention on the centrality of Colum Cille in literary tradition and Gaelic literary tradition on both sides of the North Channel, and shows how important a person he is in our tradition, as indeed the other lectures in this series have shown. Now we have some time for questions, and two have come in. Remember to use the question and answer function here. You can type in questions if you have any. The first, I'm not quite sure if we can answer this. Is there a collection of translation, a translation collection of the poems attributed to Colum Cille? Now the poems attributed to Colum Cille are many, but Thomas, I don't know if you have any idea.
Yeah, I mean, there's not one single collection of them. It would be a wonderful project, though. I think it'd be a project of several lifetimes, particularly just finding them all for starters. There's a lot of them, as well as editing and translating them. There are editions and translations of poems in Columba's voice here and there. In the course of the talk, I had a number of anthologies up that include them, such as Gerard Murphy's Early Irish Lyrics, on my own, The Triumph Tree includes a number of the sort that Rudy rightly says I've rather mischievously stuck in Scotland. There's translations elsewhere. The real kind of I suppose, kind of bedrock collection is the Laud 615 collection, which I think that there's kind of some hope that might achieve editing and translation at some point, but I don't know enough about the details of that. But unfortunately, no. But it would be a wonderful project to try to do it. But someone else, I think, rather than me.
Right, very good. And another question here, somebody asked you to revisit something you mentioned, the name of the poem or the manuscript bemoaning the Benedictine takeover of Iona. Could you mention it again?
Sorry, just needed a drink of water there. Yeah, so this is one that I translated in the Triumph Tree that I mentioned there, published in 1998. And it was edited from Laud 615 by Kuno Meyer in one of his many Mitteilungen aus irischen Handschriften. It's the first line of the poem is Marvin noch Mocholense, dead tonight is my body. In the Triumph Tree, we interpreted it, and I'm still reasonably confident with this interpretation, as a poem that belonged in around about 1203, 1204. The Benedictines took over Iona, and the poem really seems quite unhappy about a variety of different things, and particularly about the foreigners who are living on Iona. And it seems to kind of fit into that context in various different ways, especially this kind of lavish attention it plays to Religoren. We stuck it in the Triumph Tree as if it was from Scotland, but we made clear that we don't actually think it is. It actually sounds like it was composed in Derry by people whose noses were out of joint because they thought they would get to run Iona and they weren't going to get to run it anymore, basically. But we made that clear in the anthology, but felt that it somehow kind of belonged there as well. It's, so many, how do you, in a tradition that's so interlinked between Gaelic Scotland and Ireland, how do you, in some instances, how exactly do you pull apart pieces of literature that that have kind of feet on both sides of the channel? It's kind of, it's an artificial thing to do, really. We're talking about a Gaelic tradition in some cases. Sometimes it's very Irish and sometimes it's not. But this is one that's in between.
Right, very good. Well, your talk has obviously generated a number of questions. Another one here is one of the listeners mentions the tradition of the saint visiting Aaron on different days. Do you have a reference to this?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, it was in my talk. The poem itself has angels visiting Aaron on so a different angel for each day of the week. That bit of the poem, I'm actually working on an edition, a kind of full edition of the poem at the moment. The full poem's not been very satisfactorily edited before. There is an edition and translation available on archive.org from 1807 by Thomas Flanagan, I think it is. Quite a sort of, it's an edition and translation of its period, let's just say. But that's the only kind of full one that exists, but it's there and findable. I'm not sure about a tradition of Columba visiting. That rings a slight bell with me, though, a tradition of Columba visiting Aaron on particular days. So, but I might have a bit of brain freeze here. But sorry, but what I was talking about certainly was angels visiting on certain days of the week.
All right, I'm not sure if the next question will help unfreeze your brain. But, why, of all other people, should Colum Cille become the voice of so much poetry?
I see that's my good colleague Maureen who's asked that question. It's a good question. I mean, clearly there are other speakers like Ossian and Fionn and Deirdre, who get lots and lots of poetry ascribed to them or poems in their voice. I mean, some of the kind of sheer quantity is, I mean, it's a slightly artificial thing, that we're sort of comparing apples and oranges, in that quite a number of poems ascribed to Columba are from sequences in his life, so they're they belong to the narratives that they describe, ones where he's telling us Scanlan in the run up to the Battle of Drumcade, sorry, the council rather of Drumcade. Some of them are poems that are just sort of another religious poem, a devotional poem that could be in anyone's voice, but it's almost as if he's a kind of brand that people reach for. So I want to express my love of God, or I want to say something about angels. Let me say it's Columba who's saying it, and that's my, it's just a kind of easy vessel for it. And there are tons of poems that must just be, maybe sometimes it's just the scribe going, just on repeat, going Colum Cille, kicking it, so it may not always, the voice isn't always very firmly, I think, Colum Cille's voice. Sometimes that's just a label that's put on it, like fake Prada kind of stuff, but I'm not really answering Maureen's question very well. I don't think there's you don't really expect a proper answer, do you? But I think some of it is that he becomes a convenient vehicle for devotional poetry, for all sorts of kind of just religious expression. Some of the late medieval stuff is very kind of pious, devout stuff, about sin and Mary and all that kind of stuff. So he's maybe just a convenient voice in a lot of cases, but it's a good question. you know, why him rather than another saint? Why not Patrick? You know,
it could be similar in a way to the manner in which a certain amount of nature poetry is fathered on Finn McCool, and he's another prominent figure.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a similar issue. Yeah, and also it's just, oh, I'm going to talk about nature. Let me inhabit the voice of Fionn or whoever. I think it's a similar issue, except that you know, Columba's kind of a multitasker. You know, he's not just nature. You know, he's not just like Deirdre, a lamenter. He's got a whole bunch of different modes that you can plug yourself into. That at a guess, that's why he gets quite so many.
Well, we have a number of other comments and questions, but I think you've certainly earned your crust today, and you've given us a wonderful lecture, and I'm sure everybody here is very grateful to you for doing so, and for enlightening us so much about it. Just before we finish off, there are just one announcement to make, and that Sheshin and Chied Lecht Ellis Trasha, next week's lecture will be in Irish, and there will be two speakers, Charles Dillon of the Academy and Colum Cille, on Tanamatair Colum Cille Loidach agus Beha, and that will be next week on the 15th of September at the same time. So I think then it just remains for us to again express our gratitude to Thomas for enlightening us again, and indeed I suppose a measure of the lecture is the questions that it raised, and some of them are far-reaching, and there are many other questions that people will have. But we'll let you off the hook then for today, and thank you again, and we will leave it at that. So, go to Míle Magat, agus tá Palat.